399 BC, the state prison of Athens. The first sensation is the cold, a damp, living cold that seeps from the limestone walls and enters the bones, a permanent resident of this subterranean place. It smells of wet earth, of mildew, and of the quiet, lingering despair of all the men who have waited here before. For Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, this cold is now the frame for his entire world. The only light is a weak, buttery glow from a single oil lamp, its flame dancing nervously as if afraid of the shadows it creates. Shadows that cling to the stooped shoulders of the men gathered in the small cell. The sound is a low murmur of voices, thick with grief, punctuated by the rhythmic, metallic scrape of the iron fetters on Socrates' own ankles as he shifts his weight on the hard stone bench. He can feel the rough-hewn texture of the bench through his simple wool tunic, a constant, abrasive reminder of his reality. His friends are here. Crito, his oldest and most loyal companion, his face a mask of anguish. The younger disciples, including Phaedo and Apollodorus, whose open weeping fills the small space with the raw sound of loss. Yet Socrates himself remains an island of tranquility in this sea of sorrow. He speaks not of his impending death, but of the soul, of its journey, of its immortality. His voice a steady, calm instrument against the chorus of their pain. This is the narrative of him, the man who turned his own execution into a final seminar. This was the saga of the philosopher who, condemned by his own city for thinking too loudly and questioning too deeply, faced the ultimate choice between silence and death. And to understand this man, to comprehend the shocking paradox of how the most brilliant city of the ancient world could murder its greatest mind, we must ask the question that echoes through the ages. Who was this man who dared to die for the right to think differently? And why did he feel he had no other choice but to calmly accept the cup of poison from the hands of the civilization he had tried to save? This story unfolds not in a vacuum, but on a world stage crackling with tension, a Greek world at the zenith of its cultural brilliance and on the precipice of its political self-immolation. To understand Socrates, we must first understand the world that both created and destroyed him. Imagine the Mediterranean as a grand chessboard in the latter half of the 5th century BC. The two great players, the titans of the Hellenic world, were Athens and Sparta. Athens was a dazzling anomaly, a radical democracy, a naval empire fueled by silver from the mines of Laurion and tribute from 100 subject cities. It was the city of Pericles, of the Parthenon rising new and brilliant on the Acropolis, of Sophocles and Euripides revolutionizing theater. It was a city high on its own genius, believing itself to be the school of Hellas, an education for all mankind. Yet this brilliance was powered by a ruthless imperial ambition that bred fear and resentment across the Aegean. In stark opposition stood Sparta, a landlocked militaristic oligarchy, a society as rigid and disciplined as an armored phalanx. Sparta represented the old ways, tradition, austerity, order, and a suspicion of the newfangled ideas, like democracy and philosophy, that swirled through the Athenian agora. Their inevitable collision was the Peloponnesian War, a decades-long, ruinously bloody conflict that was not just a war between two city-states, but a war between two ideologies, a civil war for the soul of Greece. And watching from the east, a sleeping giant, the vast Persian Empire, a hereditary enemy, weakened but still immensely wealthy, playing the Greek powers against each other with its gold, waiting for the Hellenes to exhaust themselves. Socrates lived his entire adult life in the shadow of this titanic struggle. He was an Athenian citizen, a patriot who fought in its armies, but he was also a critic of the very democratic hubris and moral decay that he believed were leading his beloved city to its doom. He was a man of Athens, but not entirely of it, an internal exile in his own home, a philosopher trying to find universal truths in a world being torn apart by tribal hatreds and political expediency. His life's work was an attempt to forge a new kind of citizen, one whose loyalties were not just to the state, but to reason and to justice. An idea so radical it would ultimately be seen as treason. To understand this revolutionary, we must return to the world of his origins, a world far from the gilded halls of power. Socrates was not born to the aristocracy, the old families who traced their lineage to heroes and gods. He was the son of a stonecutter, Sophroniskis, a man who worked with his hands, carving stone for the magnificent new buildings of Pericles' Athens. From his father, he inherited a certain earthiness, a respect for craft and precision, and a physique that his detractors would later mock. Stocky, with a snub nose and wide-set, bulging eyes, more like a satyr than a sage. But it was the legacy of his mother, Finerete, that would truly define his life's work. She was a midwife, a woman who did not create life herself, but skillfully helped others bring it into the world. This became the central metaphor for his entire philosophy. He would later call himself an intellectual midwife, a man who possessed no wisdom of his own, but who, through a careful, probing process of questioning, could help others give birth to the ideas and truths that were already latent within them. His youth was spent not in philosophical schools, for none truly existed in that form yet, but in the vibrant, chaotic, sun-drenched laboratory of Athenian life. He would have learned his letters, memorized his Homer, and undergone the mandatory military training of every Athenian citizen. He was forged in the gritty reality of a city that was both a democracy and a slave-holding empire, a place of sublime art and brutal politics. He saw firsthand the gap between the city's lofty ideals, proclaimed in the speeches of statesmen, and the often selfish, ignorant, and contradictory beliefs of the individual citizens he met every day in the agora, the marketplace that he would transform into his personal university and ultimately his execution ground. This upbringing gave him a unique perspective. He was a man of the people who spoke their language but challenged their deepest assumptions, a stonecutter's son who would spend his life chipping away not at marble, but at the flawed statues of their souls. His first true appearance on the stage of history was not as a thinker, but as a fighter, a hoplite in the armies of Athens. To understand Socrates, one must first picture him not in a scholar's robe, but in the heavy bronze armor of a common foot soldier. He was a man who knew the physical reality of war, the sheer weight of the shield, the aspis, the feel of the spear in his hand, and the terrifying visceral chaos of the phalanx crashing into an enemy line. The chroniclers, including his own admiring students like Plato and Xenophon, report his extraordinary service in some of the most grueling campaigns of the Peloponnesian War. We must see him at the siege of Potidaea, a brutal, protracted affair where he stood his watch barefoot in the ice and snow, seemingly impervious to the cold that laid other soldiers low. It was here, as the future traitor Alcibiades attested, that Socrates saved the young aristocrat's life in battle, displaying a calm, almost otherworldly courage amidst the slaughter. We must picture him again at the Battle of Delium, a catastrophic Athenian defeat. As the Athenian lines broke and a full-scale rout began, Socrates did not run. Instead, He retreated with a small group of soldiers with such a commanding and defiant calm that the pursuing enemy horsemen reportedly turned aside, choosing easier prey. This was not the courage of frenzied rage, but something different, a deep, internal fortitude grounded in a mastery of fear itself. This experience of war was fundamental to his philosophy. When he later walked the agora and asked politicians about justice or poets about beauty, his most searing questions were reserved for the generals, whom he would ask about the nature of courage. He had seen real courage, and he knew it was not mere recklessness or an absence of fear. For him, it was a form of knowledge, knowing what is truly to be feared and what is not. The battlefield, with its stark clarity of life and death, became the crucible in which his central conviction was forged, that virtue is a kind of knowledge, and that the greatest battle is not against the Spartans, but against the ignorance within one's own soul. Behind this public life of the soldier and the street-corner philosopher lay a secret, a private mystery that set Socrates apart from every other man in Athens and was the ultimate source of both his unshakable conviction and the suspicion he inspired in others. This was his daimonion, a word often translated as his demon, but which he described as a divine sign, an inner voice. This was his hidden compass, the true north of his soul. Crucially, as he explained it, this voice never told him what to do. It never offered positive commands or revealed hidden truths about the future. Its function was exclusively negative, a divine veto. It would speak to him only to stop him, to forbid him from taking a certain action he was about to undertake, warning him away from a path that would lead to harm, or more importantly, to wrongdoing. This was an idea utterly alien to the public, civic religion of the Athenians, who sought guidance from oracles and signs about what they should do, which battle to fight, which policy to enact. Socrates' divine guide was intensely personal, an internal moral check. It was this voice, he claimed, that stopped him from entering politics in his youth, a career path natural for any ambitious Athenian, warning him that an honest man could not long survive in the snake pit of Athenian public life. It was a source of immense inner strength, giving him a certainty that transcended public opinion. When the whole of Athens screamed for a particular course of action, Socrates could stand against the tide, serene in the knowledge that his inner guide was silent. But this was also the source of the deepest distrust. To his enemies, this personal god sounded like heresy, a rejection of the city's recognized deities, Athena, Zeus, Apollo. It made him an enigma, a man who played by a different set of rules, whose ultimate loyalty was not to the assembly, not to the generals, not even to the laws of Athens, but to a whisper that only he could hear. This inner demon was the core of his integrity, the engine of his descent, and ultimately, the most damning piece of evidence his accusers would use to paint him as an impious subversive, a man guided by strange new gods. The turning point, the moment that transformed Socrates from a peculiar local character into a man with a divine mission, did not occur in Athens, but at the mystical center of the Greek world, Delphi. Here, nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, stood the temple of Apollo, home to the most powerful oracle of antiquity. To this sacred place came Socrates' fervent admirer, Chaerephon, who dared to ask the Pythia, the priestess who channeled the words of the god Apollo, a direct question. Was any man wiser than Socrates? The response, delivered from the depths of the temple amidst the scent of burning laurel leaves and intoxicating vapors, was cryptic and absolute. No man is wiser. When Chaerephon brought this news back to Athens, Socrates was, by his own account, thrown into a state of profound confusion or aporia. He knew he was not wise. He knew that he knew nothing. This divine pronouncement, therefore, could not be a statement of fact, but must be a riddle, a divine puzzle he was meant to solve. This was the fateful encounter that defined the rest of his life. It was not a meeting with a person, but with a divine decree that he interpreted as a sacred duty. He was not being crowned a king of wisdom. He was being handed a burdensome, relentless, and dangerous task. He set out to prove the oracle wrong. He would find a man wiser than himself and present this evidence to the god. This launched his famous public mission, his systematic interrogation of the so-called wise men of Athens. He went first to the politicians, the men who governed the city, and through his sharp questioning, he quickly discovered that though they had a reputation for wisdom, they could not explain the nature of the very concepts they dealt with daily, like justice. He went to the poets, the revered tellers of truths, and found they composed their great works not from wisdom, but from a kind of divine inspiration, unable to explain the meaning of their own creations. Finally, he went to the craftsmen, the artisans, and while he found that they did possess knowledge of their specific crafts, they wrongly believed that this expertise made them wise in all other, more important matters. The conclusion he reached was the foundation of Socratic irony. The oracle was right. He was the wisest of men precisely because he alone was aware of his own ignorance. This discovery was not a private comfort, but a public call to arms, a divine license to spend the rest of his days exposing the false wisdom of others, a mission that would win him a handful of devoted followers and the enmity of nearly everyone else. The initial phase of this divine mission can be seen as Socrates' own unique form of political maneuvering, a quest for a different kind of power. He sought no office, commanded no army, and possessed no wealth. His chosen battlefield was the agora, the bustling heart of Athens, and his weapon was the question. This was the price of his power, the slow, methodical, and public humiliation of the city's most prominent citizens. We must imagine the scene, repeated countless times over decades. A powerful general, a respected statesman, or a famous artist is holding forth before a crowd of admirers. Socrates, the odd-looking stonecutter's son, approaches, feigning ignorance. He professes admiration for the great man's wisdom and asks if he might be taught some small thing, for instance, the nature of piety. The great man, flattered, readily agrees to enlighten him. Then the process begins. Socrates asks a series of simple, seemingly innocent questions, each one building on the last. The great man's initial confident definition begins to unravel. Contradictions appear. Assumptions are exposed. The conversation twists and turns until the great man is tied in intellectual knots, forced to admit he does not know what he thought he knew so well. This moment of stunned silence, this aporia, happens in public, in front of the man's peers, and, most gallingly, in front of a crowd of Athens's aristocratic young men who followed Socrates around, delighting in the spectacle of their elders being intellectually dismantled. This Socratic method, the elenchus, was a revolutionary tool for pursuing truth. But in practice, it was also a devastatingly effective social weapon. Each victory for Socrates created a powerful, resentful enemy. He wasn't just refuting an argument. He was stripping a man of his public authority and his self-respect. The price of his intellectual dominance was the slow accumulation of hatred. He was seen not as a humble seeker of truth, but as a clever, ironic, and destructive force, a man who tore down but never built up. He was winning every argument while simultaneously losing the war for his own survival within the fabric of Athenian society. The great antagonist in Socrates' life was not a single person or a rival state, but a pervasive and seductive philosophy that had taken hold of Athens: Sophism. The sophists were the rock stars of their day, itinerant intellectuals who traveled from city to city, offering to teach the ambitious youth of the wealthy classes the arts of success, primarily rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. To understand their threat, we must understand their core doctrine. For the most famous sophists, like Protagoras, who declared that man is the measure of all things, there was no objective, universal truth. Truth was relative, a matter of convention or individual perception. What mattered was not what was truly just or good, but what you could persuade the democratic assembly was just or good. They sold not wisdom, Sophia, but the tools to acquire power. In the courtroom or the political assembly, the man who could make the weaker argument appear the stronger would triumph, and the sophists promised to teach precisely this skill for a hefty fee. For Socrates, this was not just intellectual error. It was a profound moral poison that was corrupting the soul of Athens. He saw the sophists as intellectual prostitutes, selling their knowledge without regard for its moral consequences. His entire life's work was a direct assault on this tyranny of doxa, or common belief. He believed in universal truths, in the existence of an absolute good, a true justice, which could be discovered through rigorous, rational inquiry. While the sophists taught men how to win debates, Socrates taught them how to live virtuously. While they charged for their services, Socrates took no money, believing that the pursuit of wisdom was a sacred calling, not a commercial transaction. This conflict was the central intellectual drama of his age. He saw the effects of sophistic thinking all around him, in the demagogues who manipulated the masses with clever words, in the moral relativism that justified Athens's most brutal imperial actions, and in a generation of young men who were taught to value success above integrity. The sophists were his macro-level antagonist because they represented the very intellectual and moral sickness that he had been divinely appointed to cure. The Peloponnesian War, the defining political event of Socrates' life, ended in utter and complete disaster for Athens in 404 BC. The city's fleet was destroyed. Its long walls connecting it to the sea were torn down to the sound of flutes, and its empire was dismantled. Into this power vacuum stepped a brutal oligarchic regime backed by the victorious Spartans, the 30 tyrants. This 8-month reign of terror was a psychological breaking point for the city, a period of bloody purges, property confiscations, and summary executions that forever scarred the Athenian psyche. And at the head of this junta was Critias, a man who had once been a part of Socrates' intellectual circle. This association became the fatal mistake from which Socrates' reputation would never recover, even though he was not responsible for his students' actions. During their rule, the 30, wary of Socrates' critical mind and moral authority, summoned him and forbade him from speaking with the young men of Athens, a command he quietly defied. More significantly, they ordered him and 4 other men to arrest an innocent citizen, Leon of Salamis, so that he could be unjustly executed and his property seized. This was a test of loyalty, a demand for complicity in their crimes. The other 4 men complied. Socrates, listening to his daimonion, simply went home, an act of civil disobedience that would have certainly cost him his life had the regime not been overthrown shortly thereafter. Yet the damage was done. In the eyes of many returning democratic exiles, Socrates was inextricably linked to the tyrants. He was the teacher of both Critias, the bloody dictator, and Alcibiades, the brilliant traitor who had done so much to bring Athens to ruin. After the terror, Athens no longer had the stomach for subtle intellectual distinctions. Socrates understood in this moment, with terrifying clarity, that ideas were not a game. He saw that philosophy, if twisted and misunderstood, could be used to justify the most horrific violence. The blood of Leon of Salamis was a testament to the real-world stakes of the moral questions he had spent his life debating in the Agora. The fall of the 30 tyrants and the restoration of democracy in 403 BC should have been a moment of triumph for law and order. Instead, it created the perfect storm for Socrates' destruction. The restored democracy was not the confident, expansive regime of Pericles. It was a wounded, traumatized, and deeply paranoid entity. It had survived a catastrophic war and a bloody civil conflict. Its citizens were looking not for nuance, but for certainty, not for critical questions, but for patriotic loyalty. And crucially, the returning Democrats, led by men like Anytus, one of Socrates' future accusers, had sworn an amnesty, a general agreement not to prosecute individuals for political crimes committed during the war or the tyranny. This amnesty, intended to heal the city's wounds, had an unintended and fatal consequence. It meant that men like Socrates could not be put on trial for his direct political associations, for teaching Critias. The city's deep-seated rage and suspicion needed an outlet, a scapegoat, and the legal avenue had been blocked. It was precisely this chaotic and fearful atmosphere that provided the opportunity for his enemies. If they could not try him for politics, they would try him for something more nebulous, more insidious: impiety and the corruption of the youth. Socrates, the relentless questioner of all traditions, the man who spoke of a private divine voice and who had been the teacher of the city's greatest monsters, was the perfect target. He used this period of chaos not to moderate his tone or to flee, but to do the opposite. He seemed to believe that now, more than ever, Athens needed his stinging philosophical medicine. He continued his work in the Agora, questioning the restored democratic leaders with the same vigor he had questioned the oligarchs, convinced that his mission was to save the city from its own worst instincts. He saw the city's paranoia as a symptom of the very moral ignorance he was fighting. He failed to see that in a city suffering from post-traumatic stress, the man who insists on examining every wound is not seen as a healer, but as a tormentor. To speak of Socrates' greatest triumph is to misunderstand the man. He won no battles, built no monuments, passed no laws. His triumphs were ephemeral, existing only in the space of a conversation, in the minds of his listeners. His greatest triumph was the perfection of his method, the moment of its most devastating and illuminating application. We must imagine such a scene, a masterclass in intellectual combat. The setting is the Agora. His opponent is a man like Euthyphro, a religious expert on his way to prosecute his own father for impiety, supremely confident in his understanding of the holy. Socrates, with his trademark irony, professes his ignorance and begs to be instructed. What, he asks, is piety? Euthyphro offers a simple definition. Piety is what I am doing now. Socrates gently points out that this is an example, not a universal definition. The intellectual dance begins. Euthyphro, growing flustered, suggests that piety is what is dear to the gods. Socrates, with a brilliant counter, brings up the Homeric tales of the gods fighting amongst themselves. What is dear to Zeus may be hateful to Hera, so the same act could be both pious and impious. The definition collapses. The crowd of young men watching, disciples like Plato among them, can barely contain their excitement. The air crackles with intellectual energy. Euthyphro, sweating now, tries a more abstract definition, which Socrates again dissects with logical precision. The climax of this scene is not a shout, but a moment of profound, uncomfortable silence. It is the moment of aporia, where Euthyphro, the expert, is forced to confront the fact that he has no rational foundation for his most deeply held beliefs. He is intellectually naked. This was Socrates' art form. He was not merely winning an argument. He was demonstrating a revolutionary idea that true wisdom begins with the admission of ignorance. This was his greatest triumph, the forced birth of humility in the mind of an arrogant man, a public demonstration that the unexamined life is a life of dangerous delusion. From the outside, this public dismantling of another man's worldview might look like an act of supreme arrogance, a display of intellectual vanity. But to understand Socrates, we must delve into the psychology of this triumph. He did not see himself as a victor and his interlocutor as a vanquished foe. In his own mind, his motivation was purely therapeutic, and his role was one divinely ordained. He famously described himself as a gadfly, a stinging insect sent by the gods to awaken the great and noble steed of Athens, which had grown sluggish and complacent. This metaphor is the key to his self-perception. A gadfly is annoying, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Its bite is sharp but not fatal. Its purpose is to agitate, to prevent slumber. Socrates genuinely believed that his relentless questioning, his exposure of ignorance, was a painful but necessary service to his beloved city. He felt no hubris in his intellectual superiority, only the heavy weight of his unique responsibility. He was, in his own view, the city's true benefactor, the only one who cared more for the health of its citizens' souls than for their comfort or their pride. This conviction gave him his almost superhuman endurance and his indifference to the hatred he engendered. When powerful men stormed away from him in anger, he saw it not as a personal failure, but as a symptom of the patient resisting the cure. This was his burden. He was the city's conscience, its living, breathing embodiment of self-examination, at a time when Athens wanted nothing more than to forget its failures and sleep the dream of its former glory. He saw his triumph not in the humiliation of another, but in the slim possibility that the painful sting of his questions might finally awaken the city to the pursuit of virtue before it was too late. It was a lonely, thankless, and ultimately fatal form of patriotism. While the sophists represented the intellectual threat, the final, deadly threat came from a trio of ordinary yet powerful citizens who personified the city's simmering resentment: Anytus, Meletus, and Lycon. To understand the trial, we must understand the personal motivations of these three accusers. The lead prosecutor and financial backer of the case was Anytus, a powerful and respected politician from the Democratic faction. He was a tanner by trade, a man who had been a key figure in the overthrow of the 30 tyrants. His hatred of Socrates was deeply personal. Anytus's own son had become a follower of Socrates, and Anytus believed the philosopher had filled the boy's head with useless ideas, turned him against his father, and ruined his prospects for a respectable career. For Anytus, Socrates was the face of a new, corrosive intellectualism that undermined paternal authority and traditional Athenian values. Then there was Meletus, the man who officially lodged the indictment. He was a young, largely unknown poet, described in the dialogues as having long, lank hair and a hooked nose. His motivation was likely a combination of youthful zealotry and professional pride. Socrates had famously demonstrated that the poets, despite their claims to wisdom, could not even explain their own poems, composing from a kind of unthinking inspiration. Meletus, representing the artistic establishment, saw Socrates as a threat to the cultural authority of his profession. Finally, there was Lycon, an orator of whom we know the least. He likely represented the professional rhetoricians, the men who made their living from public speaking, a skill Socrates held in contempt unless it was attached to a genuine knowledge of the truth. Together, these three men formed a perfect alliance of wounded pride and political expediency. Anytus brought the political credibility and financial backing. Meletus brought the righteous indignation of a fanatical artist. Lycon brought the rhetorical skill. Their personal dramas, their individual grievances against this one annoying old man, coalesced into a single legal charge that was broad and vague enough to capture all the city's fears: impiety and corruption of the youth. They were the sworn enemies who finally gave a legal voice to the decades of resentment Socrates had so diligently cultivated. Socrates' great project was not one of reforming the state's institutions, but of rebuilding its very foundation, the character of its citizens. While other Athenians focused on constructing walls, temples, and fleets, Socrates embarked on a far more ambitious and difficult construction project: the building of souls. He offered no five-point plan, no new constitution. His entire reform program was embodied in a single radical challenge: know thyself. He believed that the ills of the city, its imperial arrogance, its political corruption, its military defeats, were all symptoms of a deeper sickness, a moral ignorance that resided in the hearts of its individual citizens. His method was his madness. He would stop a man in the street and ask him to define virtue. The man, unable to do so, would be forced for the first time to confront his own ethical confusion. This, Socrates believed, was the essential first step toward true knowledge. For him, evil was not a willful choice, but simply a matter of ignorance. No one, he argued, chooses to do wrong knowing that it is wrong. Therefore, the path to a better society was through education, not the rote learning offered by the sophists, but a painful, personal journey of self-examination. His construction was the creation of a new kind of human being, the rational individual who makes his choices based not on tradition, not on emotion, and not on public opinion, but on a reasoned understanding of the good. He was, in essence, attempting to create a city of philosophers, a populace for whom the unexamined life was not worth living. This was a reform program too slow, too personal, and too demanding for a city in a hurry. Athens wanted laws and leaders who would restore its power and glory. Socrates offered them only a mirror, and they did not like the reflection they saw. His attempt to build better citizens, one soul at a time, was perceived as an attack on the city itself, a quiet revolution that was more threatening than any army at the gates. To complete the portrait of this man, we must briefly step away from the public stage of the agora and into the private, often chaotic world he inhabited. His life was one of extreme simplicity, a near total disregard for the worldly concerns that obsessed his fellow Athenians. He walked barefoot year-round and wore the same simple tunic in summer and winter. This austerity was not a pose. It was the natural result of a man who believed that wealth was a distraction from the only thing that mattered: the care of one's soul. His domestic life has become the stuff of legend, primarily through the figure of his wife Xanthippe. The later tradition paints her as a shrew, a sharp-tongued, ill-tempered woman constantly berating her husband for neglecting his family in favor of his philosophical conversations. Stories abound of her dousing him with water or flying into rages at his indifference to providing for his 3 sons. While likely exaggerated, these tales point to a fundamental truth. Socrates was not an easy man to live with. His mission was all-consuming, leaving little room for conventional domesticity or paternal affection. He belonged not to his family, but to Athens. Another crucial context was the Greek symposium, the famous drinking party, which for the Athenian elite was a primary intellectual and social arena. In the dialogues of Plato, we see a different Socrates, not just the fearsome interrogator of the agora, but a brilliant, witty, and sometimes playful guest, capable of holding his own in discussions of love and beauty while drinking everyone else under the table, yet always remaining perfectly sober himself. It was in these settings, surrounded by wine, food, and the brightest young minds of the city, that his ideas were explored in their greatest depth, far from the hostile crowds of the marketplace. This private context, his Spartan lifestyle, his tumultuous marriage, his central role in the symposium culture, paints a picture of a man living entirely on his own terms, a figure of profound internal consistency who had utterly divorced his happiness from the external markers of success, a man perfectly prepared, in the end, to lose everything the world holds dear. The storm that would consume Socrates did not gather overnight. The first cracks in his public standing, the first harbingers of his doom, appeared more than 2 decades before his trial, and they appeared not in a court of law, but on the comic stage. In 423 BC, the great comic playwright Aristophanes produced a play called The Clouds, and its main character was a philosopher named Socrates. The portrayal was a brutal, unfair, and hilariously effective piece of character assassination. Aristophanes' Socrates was not a moral philosopher searching for virtue, but a composite caricature of all the intellectual trends the average Athenian feared and distrusted. He was depicted as a sophist, a master of specious reasoning who ran a thinkery where he taught young men how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger, primarily to cheat their creditors. He was shown suspended in a basket, floating in the air so that his mind could better contemplate celestial matters, a clear mockery of his supposed detachment from earthly realities. Most damningly, he was portrayed as an atheist who rejected the traditional gods in favor of new, ridiculous deities like chaos, clouds, and tongue. The play was a wild success, and for a generation of Athenians, this caricature became their primary image of the real Socrates. He was no longer just an eccentric man in the marketplace. He was the symbol of a dangerous, amoral, and impious intellectualism. When Socrates stood before the jury at his trial 24 years later, he explicitly named Aristophanes' play as a key source of the prejudice against him. He was fighting not just the specific charges of his 3 accusers, but a phantom, a popular image of himself that had been burned into the city's imagination. The Clouds was the first gust of wind in a storm of public opinion that would, in time, become a hurricane of judicial murder. A pivotal moment that sealed Socrates' fate, a fateful act of profound integrity and political suicide, occurred during his one and only significant brush with official political power. In 406 BC, by a random process of lottery, he was selected to serve on the Boule, the council of 500 citizens that set the agenda for the main democratic assembly. During his tenure, the city received news of a great naval victory at the Battle of Arginusae. But the victory was marred by a tragedy. A storm had prevented the victorious generals from rescuing the survivors from sunken ships and recovering the bodies of the dead for proper burial, a sacred duty in Greek culture. The Athenian public, prone to fits of populist rage, was incensed. A mob mentality swept the assembly, and a proposal was put forward to try all 8 generals collectively in a single trial and sentence them all to death, a procedure that was a flagrant violation of Athenian law, which guaranteed each citizen an individual trial. The political pressure to go along with this illegal motion was immense. The other members of the council, intimidated by the furious crowd, were prepared to let it proceed. But on the day the vote was to be held, Socrates happened to be the presiding officer, the Prytanis, whose job it was to manage the proceedings. He alone refused. He stood against the entire assembly, against the threats and the screams of the mob, and declared that he would not put an illegal motion to a vote. He chose his duty to the law over the will of the people. Although his colleagues eventually caved and the generals were tragically and illegally executed, Socrates' stand was remembered. To his few admirers, it was an act of supreme civic courage. But to his many enemies, particularly powerful democratic politicians, it was an unforgivable act of obstruction. He had revealed himself to be a man who placed his own conscience, his own interpretation of the law, above the sacred will of the democratic majority. It was a fateful act that reinforced his reputation as an anti-democratic, contrarian figure, a man who simply did not know his place. The culmination of these decades of resentment, suspicion, and philosophical conflict was the greatest catastrophe of Socrates' life, his trial. The scene was the people's court, held in the open air, with a massive jury of 501 male citizens chosen by lot. We must imagine the sensory chaos of that day. The sun beating down, the dust kicked up by the shuffling feet of the enormous crowd, the murmur of thousands of voices creating an inhuman hum. On one side stood the accusers, Anytus, Miletus, Lycon, their voices shrill and indignant as they laid out their case. They accused Socrates of not believing in the city's gods, of introducing new deities, and most explosively, of corrupting the youth. They presented no direct evidence, instead relying on decades of accumulated prejudice. They pointed to the monsters he had taught, Critias and Alcibiades. They twisted his philosophical inquiries into a form of atheistic sophistry. They evoked the caricature from Aristophanes' play. Then came Socrates' turn to speak. The speech he gave, immortalized by Plato as the Apology, was one of the most remarkable and self-destructive legal defenses in history. The word apology in Greek did not mean an admission of guilt, but a formal defense. And Socrates' defense was anything but apologetic. He did not plead for his life. He did not flatter the jury, as was the custom. He did not bring his weeping wife and children before them to beg for sympathy. Instead, he taught. He explained his life as a divine mission, the story of the oracle at Delphi, his role as the city's gadfly. He cross-examined his accuser Meletus with a calm, logical precision, quickly making him look like a fool. He was defiant, proud, and utterly uncompromising. He was not speaking to the 501 jurors before him. He was speaking to Athens, to history, to the truth. In this moment of supreme crisis, he chose to be a philosopher, not a defendant. It was a moral triumph and a catastrophic tactical failure. The jurors, who were accustomed to being sovereign, were not there for a lecture. They were there to be respected and persuaded. Socrates' refusal to play their game was seen as the ultimate sign of contempt, and in that refusal, he sealed his own conviction. The trial proceeded in 2 stages, and it was the transition between them that marked the final, irreversible collapse. The jury first voted on the question of guilt. By the standards of Athenian courts, the result was surprisingly close. 280 votes for guilty, 220 for not guilty. A swing of just 30 votes would have seen him acquitted. This narrow margin suggests that many jurors were uneasy, perhaps open to persuasion. The catastrophe was not yet complete. A chance for survival remained. According to Athenian legal procedure, after a guilty verdict, the prosecution would propose a penalty, and the defendant would propose a counter-penalty. The jury would then choose between the two. The accusers, as expected, proposed death. Now all of Athens held its breath. Socrates' friends, Plato and Crito among them, were ready to pay a substantial fine. Exile was another obvious and acceptable option. All Socrates had to do was propose a reasonable punishment, show a sliver of remorse or deference, and he almost certainly would have lived. But Socrates would not, or could not, compromise his principles. He had spent his life in pursuit of truth, and he would not now engage in a lie by admitting he deserved punishment for a crime he knew was a service to the state. So, when asked for his counter-penalty, he first considered what he truly deserved. As the city's greatest benefactor, he reasoned, he deserved not a penalty, but a reward. Free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the sacred public hearth, an honor reserved for Olympic champions and war heroes. One can imagine the gasp, then the furious roar from the jury. It was an act of supreme, unforgivable irony, a final slap in the face to their authority. Though he was eventually persuaded by his friends to grudgingly offer a fine, the damage was done. The second vote was not even close. More than 80% of the jury, including many who had initially voted to acquit him, now voted for death. The collapse was total. He had not been condemned by his accusers. He had, through a fatal adherence to his own logic, orchestrated his own death sentence. The final scene of this drama unfolds not in the chaos of the court, but in the quiet solemnity of the state prison. There is no longer a crowd, only the small, devoted circle of his closest friends. For 30 days, due to a religious festival during which no executions could take place, Socrates has waited, and in that time, he has continued his work, calmly discussing philosophy as if he were at a symposium. We must picture that last day, as described by Plato. The morning light filters into the cell. His friends are there, but their grief is so overwhelming they can barely speak. Socrates, however, is not just calm. He is almost cheerful. He has just been released from his leg irons, and he rubs his leg, remarking with philosophical curiosity on the strange connection between pain and pleasure. This is the ultimate demonstration of his teaching. The philosopher's soul is free, untouched by the misfortunes of the body. He spends his final hours engaged in a long, intricate argument for the immortality of the soul, comforting his friends not with platitudes, but with logic. He argues that a true philosopher has spent his entire life preparing for death, which is merely the separation of the soul from the prison of the body. As the sun begins to set, the jailer, a servant of the state, enters. He is weeping. He tells Socrates that of all the condemned men he has known, Socrates was the noblest and gentlest, and he asks for his forgiveness for what he is about to do. The moment arrives. A man brings the cup, filled with a cloudy liquid, the juice of the hemlock plant. Socrates asks for instructions. He is told simply to drink it, and then walk around until his legs feel heavy. He takes the cup without trembling, without any change in his color or expression. He offers a prayer to the gods, then brings the cup to his lips and drains it. His friends, who had managed to contain their sorrow, now break down in loud, uncontrollable sobs. Socrates gently rebukes them, asking them to be quiet, for one should die in a tranquil state. He walks about the cell until, as instructed, his legs grow numb. He lies down on the bench. The cold from the poison creeps slowly upward from his feet. His last words, spoken to his friend Crito, are cryptic and mundane. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt. Then he's still. His finale was not a defeat. It was a masterpiece, the final, unanswerable proof of his own philosophy, a demonstration that a man who has conquered the fear of death is truly free. The physical death of Socrates was not an end, but a beginning. His execution transformed him from a man into a legend, a martyr for philosophy whose influence would shape the next 2.5 millennia of Western thought. The legacy he left behind immediately became a battlefield, a conflict of interpretations waged by those who had known him. His most brilliant student, Plato, made Socrates the hero of his famous dialogues, transforming the historical figure into a literary character of unparalleled wisdom and virtue. For Plato, Socrates was the perfect philosopher, a semi-divine figure whose trial and death were a permanent indictment of democracy and the ignorance of the mob. It is largely through Plato's genius that we know Socrates today, but it is a portrait painted with the vibrant colors of hero worship. Another student, the soldier and historian Xenophon, offered a different, more practical portrait. His Socrates is less of a mystical genius and more of a pragmatic, morally upright teacher, a good citizen who was tragically misunderstood. For his enemies and detractors, his legacy was that of a dangerous subversive, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked intellectualism. But for the generations of thinkers who followed, from the Stoics who modeled their ideal of the sage on his indifference to suffering, to the Enlightenment thinkers who saw him as a champion of reason against superstition, Socrates became the archetypal figure of the philosophical life. He is the patron saint of rational inquiry, of civil disobedience, of intellectual integrity. He is forever the man who asks the uncomfortable question, the conscience that will not let society sleep, the gadfly whose sting can still be felt across the ages. His legacy is not a set of doctrines, for he claimed to have none, but a method and an attitude, the unwavering conviction that a life stripped of self-examination is no life at all. And so, we return to the central, haunting paradox. Why did this happen? What was the true cause of this fatal schism between the philosopher and the city? The final answer is complex, a tragic confluence of politics, psychology, and personality. Athens did not kill Socrates simply for thinking differently. It killed him because he had become a living, breathing symbol of everything the city had come to fear within itself. He was, in the end, the perfect scapegoat. He was a scapegoat for the trauma of the Peloponnesian War. His relentless criticism of the city's leaders felt, in the aftermath of defeat, like treason. He was a scapegoat for the crimes of the 30 tyrants. As the teacher of Critias, he was an easy target for the city's rage, a way to punish the tyrants without violating the amnesty. He was a scapegoat for the anxieties of the democratic restoration. His questioning of its fundamental principles felt like an attack on the very soul of the restored state. And he, in turn, chose to die for reasons that were just as complex. He chose death over exile because he was a deeply patriotic Athenian who could not imagine living anywhere else. He chose death over silence, because to stop practicing philosophy would be to disobey the god Apollo and to betray his own soul. It would be the unexamined life he had declared worthless. And most profoundly, he chose death because he saw it as his final, most important philosophical lesson. By calmly accepting the unjust verdict of the city he loved, he forced a permanent and uncomfortable question upon all future civilizations. What is the relationship between the individual and the state? What is the duty of a citizen when the laws are unjust? His death was the ultimate argument that there are principles of conscience and integrity that are higher than any law, higher even than life itself. The paradox was solved in the act. The city, in a moment of fear, killed its conscience, and the philosopher, in a moment of supreme integrity, embraced his fate to become the conscience of humanity. What, then, is the final verdict of history? What is the universal lesson of the life and death of Socrates? His story represents one of the foundational conflicts of human civilization, the eternal struggle between the lonely, questioning voice of the individual conscience and the powerful, demanding voice of social orthodoxy. Socrates was the first to fully articulate and embody the idea that a person's primary duty is to the truth, as discovered through reason, and to the health of their own soul. This was a radical departure from the ancient world's emphasis on collective identity, on loyalty to the tribe or the city-state above all else. He introduced a new kind of inner authority, the authority of one's own reasoned mind, and declared it superior to the authority of tradition, religion, or public opinion. The lesson of his life is that this path is fraught with peril. Society is often a lazy horse, and it does not take kindly to the sting of the gadfly. It prefers comforting illusions to painful truths. The man or woman who dedicates their life to questioning the fundamental assumptions of their time will rarely be rewarded with honors. They will more likely be met with suspicion, resentment, and, in the extreme, persecution. Yet the lesson of his death is that this struggle is not only necessary, but noble. By choosing integrity over survival, Socrates established a new ideal of human dignity. He taught the world that the ultimate freedom is not freedom from chains, but freedom from ignorance and fear. His life was the birth of conscience as a force in human history, the radical proposition that one good person, standing firm on a principle, can be more powerful than a state, an army, or a mob. The final frame of this epic saga is not one of violence or of triumph, but one of quiet, profound stillness. It is the image of the empty cup, resting on the cold stone floor of the Athenian prison cell. The hemlock is gone. The man is gone. His friends have departed, carrying his last words and the memory of his final moments out into the world. The cup itself is a simple earthenware vessel, an object of no value. Yet, in the silence of the cell, it becomes a powerful and enduring symbol. It is not an emblem of death, but the embodiment of a question that Socrates has left for all of eternity. The cup represents a choice. It represents the ultimate price of intellectual integrity. It asks every individual, in every generation, what are you willing to risk for what you believe to be true? Are you willing to challenge the comfortable lies of your own society, of your own time? Are you willing to face the anger of the crowd, to remain true to the whisper of your own conscience? The empty cup is Socrates' final legacy. It is a challenge, a testament, and a warning. It sits there through the centuries, a silent monument to the man who drank the poison to prove that ideas, and the courage to live by them, can be more powerful and more permanent than the city, the laws, and even death itself.